Hey there and welcome back to another Illumination video. And today, since we've arrived into the holiday season, I figured I'd try to keep getting myself into the Christmas spirit. And so, I want to talk about 2018's The Grinch, based on the Dr. Seuss classic, starring Benedict Cumberbatch in the title role. Now, for those of you who have somehow not heard the story of The Grinch, it pretty much goes like this. The Grinch is a mysterious green furry creature that lives near the town of Whoville. And despite hating them and all they stand for, the Grinch has no choice but to interact with the town and its people, as it's the only place for him to buy food. However, there's one problem. Christmas. He hates Christmas due to childhood trauma of living abandoned and unwanted in an orphanage, being unable to celebrate Christmas at all. Over the course of the film, he tries to destroy the Who's light show to ruin their fun, but when that fails, he concocts a grand scheme to steal their entire Christmas and leave them heartbroken, just like him. Meanwhile, a little Who child named Cindy Lou Who wishes to capture Santa Claus alongside her friends, as she wants to ask him for an extra special present, for him to help her mum, who's currently struggling as a single parent of 3. And so their storylines collide on Christmas Eve. The Grinch, dressed up as Santa, decides to enter the town and take everything Christmas related from the stores, homes, and public places. We're talking presents, lights, decorations, food, all of it stolen and dumped off a cliff to ensure that Christmas is cancelled. And here is where he meets Cindy Lou, and her request touches his heart. And yet, despite this, he continues on with his mission. But the next day, the Who's celebrate anyway, and begin to sing together despite their lack of material goods. And this in turn engulfs the Grinch in the Christmas spirit, and turns him good. Yeah, I know. He brings back the presents and the lights and everything else. He apologizes, and apparently it's just all good. They invite him for Christmas dinner, and everybody lives happily ever after. The end. And I remember going to see this thing, or maybe streaming it. Honestly, I can't remember now if I did go to see it in the cinema. Jesus, how was 2018 4 years ago? Time just needs to slow down. Anyway, at some point in the past, I've seen this film, and I thought it was pretty decent. Nothing hugely revolutionary or groundbreaking, but fun enough. To use some Christmas lingo for you, this film is the epitome of the stocking stuffer. Something that you probably didn't ask for, and it's not the main event or attraction, but you can still think, yeah, that's pretty cool, before you move on with your life. It did fairly well for itself at the box office, grossing $512 million off a budget of $75 million, which I think's more than fair. And so if you asked me, I'd expect the Rotten Tomatoes score would probably sit between the mid to late 60s and the mid 70s. An average score for an average film. Nothing too special, but nothing too bad either. But I guess I would be wrong in that assumption, because when you look at the scores, it tells a very different story. From a critical perspective, the film has a score of 59% on Rotten Tomatoes, which, yeah, that's quite low. The consensus being from critics that whilst the film looks good and gives a bright and fresh update to the story, it's very derivative and doesn't add anything new to the tale. Meanwhile, it seems the opinions of the audience fares no better, as we actually see that the audience score is lower at 51%, which is, yeah, that's the one that surprised me the most. Usually this is the type of film I'd see and expect that critics wouldn't like it, but audiences might be more favourable. But they don't seem to like it at all. 2 rotten scores. And so, in these moments, where critics and audiences both unite in calling a film trash, you'd think that only a madman or a fool would actually try to defend a film like this. To dare say that it's not as bad as people are claiming. Or those dreaded words, am I the only one who thinks The Grinch is underrated? But what do you know? I'm either a madman or a fool. I'll leave that up to you. Because here I am today telling you that The Grinch really isn't all that bad. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not completely delusional. I'm not going to try to swindle you into believing that this is some complete and utter masterpiece that reinvents cinema. That the world just wasn't ready for a film of this majesty. I'm not saying that. But is it as bad as people say? No, not by a long way, and it has a lot going for it. For starters, visually it looks great. And I'm not just talking about animation quality. After all, this is a film by one of the big animation studios. In the last decade or so, Illumination's carved out a massive place for themselves as an animation giant that just oozes money with everything they make. They're not going to make a film that has shit visuals. It just ain't happening at this stage. But I'm more talking about the style. It really does feel like they managed to capture the essence of both the Dr. Seuss books and the world. The characters look like they belong in the world of Seuss, looking both normal and yet otherworldly too. Just like the characters from the books. And on top of that, the world design itself, the colours, the spectacle. They give the film this warm, storybook type quality that fits it very well. And then the story itself. You know, it's fun enough. It doesn't really deviate from the source material too hard, but they do flesh out the character of Cindy Lou to give her her own arc within the film, although that being said, of the two main story threads, her story is definitely not as fun or compelling as the Grinch's, and does serve to bloat the story a tiny bit. But I think it's redeemed by the fact that they do tie it back in very well, and her good heart, in the end, serves to play a key role in the conclusion of the Grinch's arc. And ultimately, I think a key problem that a lot of people have had with this film is just the lack of change. It's largely the same thing as what they've seen before. It doesn't add anything super new to the story, and thus they can't understand why it was made in the first place. Well, besides the fact that it was clearly going to do well at the box office and make the studio some serious money. And ultimately, isn't that the most important thing a film can do? Make money? That's why they're made in the first place. It doesn't have to justify its existence. It does so with box office returns. Honestly, this is the same type of annoyance I get when people talk about Marvel and wonder how they still keep getting made despite not being true cinema or something like that. It's because they generate a lot of money, Jesus. This in turn gets the investors rich, and in turn allows further investment, which means more films and more jobs and more money. How hard is that to grasp? Bit of a side tangent there, but still, it's the same principle. But yes, the story doesn't do much differently to what we've seen in the past. But does that matter? Why should that play into whether something's good or not? Hell, it's not like this is the Christmas Carol, with dozens and dozens of adaptations, all of them largely doing the same thing with little variation. This thing's had, 3 direct film adaptations? And the last major animated work for this story was released in the 1960s. And it's largely a completely page-by-page adaptation. This film instead is a more modernized take. It's clearly made for a new generation audience. And I think that, in and of itself, is a fair justification of its existence. Beyond that, the acting's fairly decent, if not hugely notable, with nobody really standing out as being actively bad at their role, although I don't think I'll ever come to truly enjoy Benedict Cumberbatch using an American accent. Even in Doctor Strange, it gets me to raise my eyebrows from time to time. But yeah, the acting's solid. And that in turn brings me to the finer details of the writing, the jokes and the dialogue, and maybe this is the place where people got turned off, I don't know. Because I will admit, this film is standard Illumination type humour. There is a lot of emphasis on physical comedy and a lot of toilet humour type of things. And that's the kind of stuff that's going to get the kids cackling, and hell, it'll even get the adults chuckling from time to time, but then, admittedly, it does get oversaturated to the point that it's probably not that funny anymore. Maybe that's the reason that people would give as to why this film's so unpopular. But then when you actually read the major reviews, that's not the case. The reality is that people are so stuck on that version from the 60s. They're so nostalgic about it, they can't understand why this film was made at all. It's almost like that since this film was simply average, it means that they don't think its existence is justifiable in any way, shape or form, and thus, it gets even more hate than I think it deserved in the first place. And thus, it got a very terrible critical response. Far worse than you'd expect from a film like this. And so, I think in the end, is The Grinch a great film? No. But it's certainly fun enough, and it's nowhere near as bad as people would lead you to believe. It's a little bit derivative, and the humour does get tiring from time to time. But the acting's solid, the story's fun, the soundtrack's upbeat and festive, and the world design's vibrant and pretty. Completely and utterly watchable. And so yeah, that's probably the end of the video. And I would like to remind you that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the Grinch film? Do you think it was absolute trash tier? Do you think it's the second coming of Christ? Or is it somewhere in between? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.